Hello. So we are back with our chat with the counselor time. Marie is our counselor, and I'm Amanda. So each week we are going to be coming together to dig into the Sunday message and to talk a little bit more deeply about how our mental and emotional health play a role in that particular topic that was covered. So this past Sunday, we learned about loss and grief. And we had the privilege of hearing the story of Jeff and Julie Lebelichik and the tragedy and the loss and the grief that they had to process, and how God worked through them, in them, and met them in that valley. And it was such a powerful story. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, or if you want to rewatch it, I highly recommend it. You can jump ahead to the 25-minute mark in our gathering video and dig into that message there. So as we come together today, we're going to be talking about loss, grief, and everything that happens with that in terms of our mental and emotional health. So Marie, thanks again for joining us and joining me and having this conversation.
Sure, thank you.
So we'll jump right into it. What happens when we experience a loss and we start grieving?
I think everybody's experience of grief is a little bit different. You know, some people have much stronger emotions than others, but typically our brain kind of goes into overload, and where our thoughts of grief and sadness and loneliness and our feelings are just overwhelming. They have something, there's a term called grief brain that can affect your memory, your concentration, your cognition, and it's difficult to focus and do your everyday tasks. And I think a big part of that too is that it's hard to even think that those everyday tasks are even important because of the loss of your loved one.
Mm.
So it's usually that's what's happening when a person experiences grief.
Mm. And what are the ways that you would process grief, and how does grief look like in someone?
Mm-hmm. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she wrote a book called Death and Dying, and she talks about 5 stages of grief. And then again, everybody experiences grief a little bit differently, and some people may experience just 1 or 2 of these stages, or it may take longer. And of course, they're not linear. They may happen, you know, in a different order. But typically, what happens is you experience denial, anger, there's bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And so some examples of denial might be like just that sudden shock that you have when you realize that you've lost your loved one. You know, as Mitchell mentioned yesterday in the sermon, that we aren't supposed to experience this loss, and it's very much like a trauma or a shock. And so oftentimes we can be in denial. We may even think that we see our loved one, even though that we know that we've lost them. And then the second stage, anger, is that, again, like Julie was talking about, this kind of like this anger with God, this why God, and maybe even there's anger towards the loved one that, you know, perhaps you might feel like they should have taken better care of themselves or something like that. There are different things that we might be angry about, but usually it's a very intense feeling, and it's something that, you know, that's kind of like we're working through, that we need to work through. And each of these stages are things that we would work through. And then there's bargaining, and that's when you have these, you know, if only I had, you know, if only I had taken the person to the hospital sooner, if only I made that phone call, sort of like bargaining, like if I had done these things, they never would have died, you know. So that's an example of the bargaining. And then depression, which is like that overwhelming sadness that I described. It just really can overcome someone, or just you know, a slight memory of the person can just cause you to be really sad. And you know, I talk to people about their grief, and they'll say that they'll have some really good days, and then other days like they won't want to get out of bed for a few days. And I think it's important that people see that it's okay to have those days, and that they are grieving, and that that's a normal response to the grief and the loss of a loved one. And then acceptance, that is when you know, finally are able to accept that the person has died, and you're not really kind of cycling through any of these other stages anymore. And it's not that, you know, you're not sad anymore, but you really have kind of accepted, like, this is something that it kind of starts to integrate into your life. And then some people, like I said, may take longer than others. You know, usually the first year you're in a really long fog. The people in grief share talk about how they'll go through it one time, and then when they go back through it a second time, they don't remember any of the videos that they had watched because they had been in such a fog the first year around.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we likely have someone in our life that is grieving in one way or another, as we are all living through this pandemic together. And so how would you best recommend someone to walking alongside another person as they're grieving?
Mhm. So I think that people will often feel like they have to say the perfect thing, or that they shouldn't say anything at all. For instance, they might feel like they're going to make somebody feel worse, so they're just going to talk about the weather, or they're just going to talk about COVID, but they're not going to bring it up. And I think it's so important for people to hear that other people are recognizing that they're grieving, just by saying, "I'm really sorry that this happened," or "I don't even know what to say, but I'm here for you if you need me." Brene Brown says that rarely can a response make somebody feel better. It's just the importance of connecting with them. And I know that a lot of us can't be there with our loved ones in their losses. And so making a phone call, or trying to do a Zoom call, or even just writing a letter, writing a note to someone can really make them feel better when we're so isolated.
Yeah, I find myself wanting to fix and wanting to make them feel better, and I have to remind myself it's not my job, nor do they have the power to make someone feel better. That's really,
Mhm.
when you're grieving something, you're going to feel crappy and not great. And so
Mhm.
the I have to remind myself that the importance of reaching out to someone is more about the connection itself and just being there rather than trying to fix. And
Mhm.
I know we can find ourselves saying things with good intentions, but maybe causing more harm. I know Jeff mentioned that yesterday too, as he was sharing in his, when he was sharing his story, and he mentioned Job and his friends, and there were maybe good intentions, but at the end of the day, really wasn't helpful. So we actually pulled together on our blog some phrases to avoid, or some things to avoid
Mhm.
saying to someone that might be grieving, and then some helpful prompts
Mhm.
in comforting someone that's grieving. So you can
Mhm.
check that out on our blog as well. So my last question for you: what does unprocessed grief look like? And yeah, I know that as we're talking about grief right now and loss, it's very timely in that we're all going through this to some varying degree. But there, life happened before Corona. It's going to continue to happen after
Mhm.
Corona, and it's very possible that many of us are living with unprocessed grief. So, what does that look like, and what can you do about it?
So I would think through the stages at first and see if one of those stages kind of ring true for you a lot. Like, do you find yourself bargaining a lot? Are you angry and irritable? And can you connect that to a recent loss, or loss, loss of a job, or loss of a family member, or loss through divorce, or some other type of loss? And trying to get in touch with, like, oh, did I ever allow myself to feel those sad feelings about this? And if you haven't, maybe journal about it, and journal about that loss a little bit. That can be very therapeutic. And sometimes with our losses, we may experience that initial loss, but not have really recognized the secondary losses that come along with that. So for instance, if you lose a parent at a young age, maybe they weren't around to be there for your wedding, or be there, as grandparents. And so allowing yourself the space to be able to be sad about those things, like you were saying, you feel like you want to make people feel better. That's really common in our society, that we want to cheer people up and make them feel better. But oftentimes, if we're sad and we allow ourselves to grieve, then we'll feel better on the other side. It's like joy comes in the morning, after the grief.
That's so good. So what types of resources and help is available for those that are in the process of grieving or need help processing it? What are healthy ways to process grief?
Mhm.
How would you point someone in the right direction there?
So I think most people are able to grieve on their own, and they grieve well. They grieve with family members, and a big part of that is the memories and the shared time together. You know, usually shortly after a loss. But again, like when we talked about with COVID, we may not be able to do those things like we would have before that. And so maybe journaling a little bit about that. And if you're finding that you're really, you know, wanting to connect with other people, we offer grief share on an ongoing basis, and people really feel like they're heard and understood, and other people have similar experiences, so they aren't feeling all alone. And then we have a new group that's coming out in a couple weeks called The Loss of a Parent, like remembering our parents. And so that might be another place for people to go. And then, of course, we always offer some individual help if people would prefer to do that rather than in a group.
Mhm.
But as I said, a lot of people can just kind of go through this on their own with their families or with other loved ones.
Mhm. Sounds like though being in community and not letting yourself be stuck in that isolation as you're processing that
Yeah,
grief is important. Um,
yeah.
so for those of you who are watching, if you find yourself needing help processing your grief, or down the line you find yourself grieving and you need help, just know that we are here for you. You can reach out to us, counseling@gcconline.org. That goes right to Marie, so you know that she's the one answering that, and it's not some random, internet black hole that it's going to. And yes, just reach out for help if that's what you need. And if you need prayer, we have our prayer calls that are happening every day, 12 o'clock and 7 o'clock. Those are also great ways to just plug yourself into community. You can be as anonymous as you'd like. We also have those groups that are starting that Marie mentioned, and all of that can be found on our website. So we encourage you during this time to not be alone, to not isolate, really find community where you can. So thanks again, Marie, for this wonderful chat. Always a pleasure, and learned so much from you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.